Thank you everyone for being here and welcome to our class, Designing for the Real World. I'm Wing.
And I'm Bliss.
Thank you so much to Slow Factory for having us teach this class. We're really excited.
I'm so excited.
Welcome to our class, Designing for the Real World. It's an introduction to provenance-based design, which is a sustainable approach to the creative process, which puts our supply chains first.
As conscious designers, we often start our process with a chosen material system and design around those limitations. There are centuries of conflict within the jewelry industry fueled by the exploitation of labor and resources from the global south for the benefit of the global north.
So, sustainability and humanitarian issues are not our specialty, but we as designers care about where our jewelry comes from and what impact it makes, which is why we're here today and sharing with you what we know. So first of all, Bliss, do you want to start off by telling us who you are?
Sure. Hi, I'm Bliss. I have a collection of fine jewelry that is called Bliss Lau. I've had a company for over 17 years, and I have a background in fashion design. I started off as a handbag designer, and then I transitioned into body chains, which was sort of the equivalent of costume jewelry, and then moved into fine jewelry in about 2014. If you see here on the right, there's a photo of Lanikai, Hawaii. I grew up in Hawaii, and I think growing up on the island informed an awareness of how I use and what I use, and understanding the importance of not wasting and how precious our resources are. I came to conscious design because earlier in my career, when, as you see, there's this amazing photo of Naomi Campbell wearing my body chain. When I first started, I had this mindset, and so I thought that I was being really conscious, and I made my body chains out of the old strips of leather from my handbags, and then some of the chains from my handbags, but I also went and found dead stock chains, had them stripped and replated, and then reused those. So if you're like, oh, that's being responsible, right? But what I didn't know was that the factory that was doing that replating was creating toxic waste and just dumping it. And I found that out and obviously stopped working with them. And it was devastating to me. I thought that I was doing everything right. And that to me was a really big pivot point of how to acknowledge and work as a conscious designer and the steps that I have to take in order to really have a process by which I build out my supply chain and understand an ethical alignment that I have to have with all of my suppliers along the way. Because I think that even small decisions as a designer can impact the community. And that's something that we're going to talk about today.
Thanks so much, Bliss. I think that's such a great thing to share, because people will say oh, I've made mistakes, but really everything is part of this process of trying to be better. And mistakes are really just opportunities to learn. So I'll transition into my slide. My name is Wing Yau, and I'm the designer of the jewelry brand Wake, which I started as a fine jewelry line in 2013. I grew up traveling and living abroad because my dad, who's an engineer, actually worked in mining. He doesn't work with precious metals like we do, but more like copper and zinc. But anyway, the point of me telling you this is that not only did I have an experience at a really early age of what it's like to live in a developing country and have a basic understanding of the socioeconomic dynamics at work in countries like Peru, which is where I lived. I also grew up with an early exposure to what mines look like, big and small, which has honestly helped me so much as a designer today to push forward and asking questions about where my materials come from, under what conditions they've been mined, and how I can better design to support the communities at the source by first and foremost building upon the knowledge that I have of what the context is. I try and do a site visit every year. On this slide, you can see me visiting my first mine in 1995. I'm wearing the pink United Colors of Benetton t-shirt. And then on the left, that was a site visit I did in Kenya last year. So, okay, what context are we working in? What does their sourcing look like if we pull out in a very big picture way? And how does this impact our design philosophy?
So we wanted to give you a little landscape of when designing what your industry is. And so for us, our industry is jewelry, and our industry is massive. There are 140 million people worldwide that are affected by this industry. 40 million of them are artisanal small scale miners, and 7 million are industrial miners. So if you look at this number, 17 plus additional individuals are indirectly reached for each miner through job creation and familial support.
Bliss, could you quickly run through some examples of like what those 17 additional individuals are on top of the miners who are working?
Yeah, what happens around the mine? So let's start with there's the family members of the miners. There's people providing food, people cleaning and organizing things, and then all of the other sort of ancillary people that are helping support the mining system, like maybe picking up the gems and moving them from one place to the other. And there's a lot of individual people who are managing things in between that. And it's a huge amount of people around one mine.
Absolutely. So, okay, 140 million people worldwide. So this is like a complex, like immensely huge industry. And like any other industry, like, or any other like complex economies, I should say, like this one also has gaps open for exploitation of workers and their families and everyone else that they're like linked to in the supply chain, who are at the source of the materials and often like the most vulnerable people in a supply chain. This includes, but isn't limited to, environmental risks like toxic waste, dredging, deforestation, humanitarian risks like dangerous and unhealthy work conditions, unpaid labor, child labor, extortion, unfair pricing, just in general, like suppressed opportunities for growth in some of the most marginalized communities in the world, which are also supported by trade like practices such as like money laundering. So when I first started looking into our sourcing, like I could no longer deny that my materials are part of like a very real world with like millions of people involved. And I think that for me as a designer, this context means that intentional sourcing from responsible mining communities is all the more important because it supports the solutions. By sourcing responsibly and transparently from a specific source and like thinking intentionally in that way, like it bolsters development models that break these patterns of exploitation and creates like deep and meaningful impact with communities that are sometimes that are often the most marginalized in the world. And it also, like those also create model examples for other communities to model after and make progress as well. So for me as a designer, I can't say that there's like a perfect solution, a perfect source for my materials, but it's really about like looking at this big picture and thinking about like how I can contribute to the long-term progress of these development models. You know, that being said, like I think that focusing on like small mining communities, which is what I'm really passionate about, comes with a lot of challenges, which I'll cover, and it can also be scary. So another area of the jewelry industry that we focused on is closed loop sourcing and like circularity in general.
We have a lot of overlap in our work, but I have a really strong focus on circularity. And ultimately, circularity is the idea of designing without waste, right? And so it creates a clean container for the rotation of materials. Within the jewelry industry, actually, we have always had circularity because gold was one of the first instances of a material working in a circular system. Because of its value in society, people have dedicated the time to developing the circular systems it exists in. And I think that's a really interesting fact to highlight, and it is a benefit and a problem because in many cases, Wing and I have both experienced people who believe that they're working in a circular way, but maybe they're mixing old gold with new gold, and so that causes challenges too. But I think when you think about this idea of circular economy and circular systems, it feels really huge. And I actually believe that there's ways that on like a daily level, we can, use this idea as a mindset.
It's totally about mindset. Yeah, I totally agree. So like what are closed loop sources in the jewelry industry?
So I know it must sound weird to recycle a ring, but basically what that means is we take the stones out and we actually recycle the metal back into the system. And so that's like, we both use recycled gold. It gets refined and then recycled. There's dead stock materials. Usually this is over 20 years old, neglected by the market due to lack of popularity. And that has a lot to do with this idea of sort of socially constructed notions of beauty. And there's a lot of material that was cut and it's sitting in people's safes that I have access to now because people only wanted to buy a certain color because that's what they thought was beautiful. But now we don't think like that. And we all can understand different colors and make purchases and choose colors based on our individual views, which I think is really great and something that happens now. There's also heritage rough. So this is rough stones, things that haven't been cut yet. Like dead stock material is something that's ready to be used, whereas rough is something that still needs to be recut into a gemstone.
Raw, untouched gemstone. It's like a rock, basically.
Yeah. And that was usually mined, 17 or more years ago, and then it becomes cut and polished into gemstones today. But thinking about designing for the real world, I think that a lot of this has to do with understanding your own philosophy. And I think that's really core to determining how our products are made. Wing, do you want to talk a little bit about your philosophy?
Yeah, totally. So my philosophy is that nature is amazing and that, we're attracted to it because it has this like amazing quality that like mankind can't imitate. And when I'm making jewelry with natural materials, that is the connection between you and the earth. So it's spiritual, but from a practical perspective, if you source transparently, like jewelry is not only the connection between you and the earth, but also every person and every hand in between that touches the material and like helps move the material forward until it gets to me in New York City. So, I think that knowing who these mining communities are and like how I can like design to support their overall growth starts with transparency. If you don't know where your materials are from, then you don't know like who has touched it at all or how many people there are. And so transparency is super key to supporting my philosophy on like connection. And, I'll be honest, like when I started as a fine jewelry designer in 2013, I had no idea where my materials came from. I kind of like got the idea of like, I was told like what countries they were from. And I wasn't really sure if that was like true. And I didn't really know how to evaluate it at all. And I was afraid to do the research because I was afraid of like what I would find and if it would only be terrible things. And so I spent a good year, maybe almost two, like just not talking about it and not really knowing what to do and continually making stuff and continually sourcing as you do when you make things. And I started losing sleep at night. And at a certain point, I started doing the work. And of course, I opened the door and there was a flood of considerations that I now have to make when I'm designing my jewelry. And rather than making me feel small like I was afraid it would, I've realized that knowledge is power and that I feel so much more empowered in understanding like the greater context that like my designs live in the world and how my jewelry actually can have impact or how it does no matter whether I think about it like that or not. So, doing this research and transforming my company into caring about transparent supply chains has really changed my whole attitude. And my business model, I like to say now, is like rooted in having empathy for a world outside of like my own design bubble and your own like expectations. And so for me, everything is a transparent conversation now, like how we source our materials from communities, how I manage my team, how we speak to customers and like how we educate them and how I hope that they approach their purchases with us. To me, like every layer of my design business is about connection. It's about building those transparent long-term relationships and doing better together because it has to be a conversation. I can't just decide like the way I want things to work here in New York and have that filter through multiple supply chains around the world that we source from.
I think that's a really good point, Wing, because there's the thing that you want and then there's the thing that exists in the world and it's all a spectrum, right? It's all so nuanced.
Totally. And so, there are a lot of challenges in doing this work, but this is all to say that if you build your own philosophy, there's power in that because you should always be able to fall back on that like ethos to guide you. Like, for example, I'm open to sourcing materials that don't have like perfectly checking all the boxes of sustainability. I think that's actually a really unfair expectation. But if I am sourcing materials from maybe heritage materials, as you describe them to be, that might not have like positive impact in at the source because it's old, rough, I will still consider it as a valuable contribution to making positive impact at a different source, because the person, my friend and like sourcing partner that I purchased this from, takes the profits from those heritage rough sales, and they then use it to bolster and make progress with miners who like work is a work in progress in terms of safety, sustainability, like legal trade, and environmental practices. And he invests the profits that he makes from my purchases into buying them equipment, giving them education, and basically leveraging their perspective and like their ability to advocate for themselves in this world where they're often marginalized. And so, when I'm looking at materials, I wonder like, okay, even if I'm getting a material that might not go all the way to the source and provides that positive impact that I'm so passionate about, like how does it contribute to this like greater idea of like connection in a very like real way, not like woo-woo way. So that's my example. But Bliss, I actually think you have a really interesting philosophy that's really rooted in circularity. So could we switch over to you to talk about that?
Yeah, I believe in jewelry as an experience. And I think that experience is connected to the experience of us making the jewelry and then you owning the jewelry and even just the process before the jewelry as the pieces are made and as things are mined, if I buy mined. But I do also work with mostly circularity, I would say. When I am working with miners or working with vendors, I think that I believe that the process has a lot to do with an ethical alignment. And I think that's also true with circularity. This idea of working with what exists in the world and exploring new ways to renew them and keep them in use is really important to me. But if you ask for ethical alignment, how do I know that someone is actually selling me something that was set in something before and they're not just lying to me and telling me that it was? And so I think that goes really deeply into the sort of evaluation process that Wing and I both have, that we've implemented. And it's in some cases very formal, in other cases more informal, but just learning about the ethos of the people who are providing with us with the merchandise is really valuable. And I think it's taken me away from that experience that I had in the past that I mentioned. I agree that each stage in the process of making is definitely an opportunity to support our environmental responsibility. This piece that you're looking at, this image, is an example of my renew process of circularity. The rings on the top are the rings that we took the stones out of, which you see on the left. And a friend of mine, I made this ring for a friend of mine whose both of her parents passed away. And she wanted something that connected her to them and brought this memory, this painful memory, into sort of a hopeful future memory. And I think that that transformation is really important with design. And that sort of like, I thrive off of that. And I also love the idea that I didn't waste anything. We melted down her rings and put them back into the cycle. And I think that idea is so beautiful. And I'm really, I just love working in this way with circularity. It makes me so excited.
I think that's also like a great example of like how your philosophy develops as you go, and like all of these little anecdotes, meaningful anecdotes and experiences that you have, like with this friend and client, like really help you build the depth to your philosophy over time, and like makes, your ethos actually meaningful rather than something you just say you'll strive to do. So lived experience is everything. So our question for you is, in the audience is like, okay, well, what is your ethos as customers and designers? Like, what do you care about when you're designing and like purchasing products in the world? Like what kind of impact do you want to make with that kind of like through your ethos? Do you care about circularity and your environmental impact? Do you care about social impact? And whether you're sourcing from a development project in a country abroad, like what is the hook for you and what's driving you?
I like to talk about this a little bit when you think of people or planet. But actually, the reality is there isn't really people without planet. But if you just take a step back and think about, Wing's perspective of supporting mining communities through her purchasing, and then my perspective of working with circularity, which has a lower environmental impact, and it definitely, like, they're not mining. So whenever you're buying something that isn't mined, newly mined, there's a value to that. But I think there's a lot of overlap in both ideas. And, like, in a way, I love the idea of supporting people. And so I think it's interesting to ask yourself these questions. And we would love to hear from you at the end.
Okay, so let's talk about provenance and how it relates to product strategy. First, let's talk about traditional product strategy. This is what Bliss and I like to say is like a price forward strategy, because traditionally companies will like start with an idea, and most importantly, they'll define a price that they feel they need to sell that product at in order to reach their customers. This traditionally is the entry point of design for like mass produced products. And so the price is like really important in terms of like being able to like get that reach and to appeal to everyone, like the masses. So if you define the price first and then go backwards from there, you then have to find materials and find supply chains that somehow fit into those parameters.
I think there's a lot lacking in this process, because I like to think about things as mindsets. And when you look at the mindset of, I'm going to make a product for this price, immediately, like, all of the social justice and environmental justice components just fall by the wayside. And you're just focusing on, how can I get this? How much does it cost? Can you make it cheaper? What are our options for that? And I think that it sort of builds an opportunity to ignore rather than an opportunity to explore, which is really unfortunate. And that's sort of why we both work in the idea of provenance-based design.
Right. Bliss, maybe I should share an example really quick. Like, let's say I'm just starting my jewelry design business and I have this, I don't know much about like supply chains and like how to source my materials. Okay, so I have this cool design idea for a solid gold ring, and I want the ring to be something that me and all of my friends can splurge on and afford. So like maybe $100 like seems like a reasonable price for that. I think like maybe some of my friends could like splurge on something that's a little bit more expensive, but this is like a good price point, $100, to appeal to like a wider scope of my friends. But I'm a new designer, so I also want to sell to stores so that more customers can discover me through those stores. So then I need a wholesale price. So if the final price is $100 and the wholesale price should be about $40. And if the wholesale price is $40, that means the actual cost that I have for the materials and the labor that go into making this piece is about $20. But then again, like there's logistical fees like shipping and other stuff like that. So maybe I'm actually down to $18 to $15 to make that $100 solid gold ring. I like to make my stuff domestically. So I'm thinking like, okay, minimum wage, I have $18 to $15, but minimum wage in New York is $15. That's not a living wage also. It's minimum wage. And gold is expensive. And so that's the beginning of how hard that process is, even for like a new designer, or especially for a new designer, because what do you do with that $15? Like, and there are ways to strategies to solve those problems and find solutions. But the point of this slide and talking about traditional product strategy is that starting with price first just completely doesn't prioritize people or planet in the process. And it has you try to fit them in to like even tighter parameters than like the world practically already offers. So this is all to say, like, what if we flip that process? What if we started with the material and then designed around a supply chain and actually designed to sell a product that was meant to support like transparency and fair trade materials?
Yeah, I think this is the way that we work, right? We call it provenance-based design strategy, which is a design strategy and process that begins with a material with a transparent supply chain before considering all other factors. So if you lead with this, it again moves into the idea of mindset. And I just want to give you an example of a way that this process has worked for me as I'm a designer. I'm actually like a really slow designer. For every collection I make, I feel like Wing probably makes 5, but I spend a long time thinking about everything, and I could talk for days about the problems of perfectionism. But so what you're looking at is some jade, and I'm Chinese American, and jade for my heritage is really important to me. And so I've always wanted to redesign the jade bracelet, and I finally started researching it. And I think that it's sort of like the pinnacle of a modern heirloom. When I started looking into jade, I discovered that there's a lot of different kinds. Obviously, we know there's jade, and then there's jadeite and nephrite. These are 2 different types of jade. That beautiful jade that my aunties were wearing was what I was trying to find. And what I came up against were a hugely opaque market where I wasn't able to find answers for the questions that I asked. There was a lot of, oh, just trust me, it's fine. And like, that's not like an answer that I can accept. So,
are you saying that they didn't know where it was from?
Who knows what they said, but like in further understanding of jade, there's human rights violations with jadeite and social justice issues that I just didn't feel comfortable taking people at their word. So what I ended up doing was pivoting and finding a nephrite jade from Australia that I could work with. And so I went from color, and then this is where my design decision changed, and I moved into black jade. And I was really excited about the black jade. And so I did my sourcing finished, moving into design process. I designed this, like the idea of redesigning the jade bracelet, this beautiful, as you can see, like triangular shaped bracelet with like a wrapped piece of gold around it. And what I found was I had that made. I launched the collection, I'm a couple of years in on this process already. And then my manufacturer could not replicate this design. Like the shape that I was asking the artisans to cut was too different than the shapes that they were traditionally comfortable cutting. So I had to go back and then even find a new source. So I found another source for Australian black jade. And on the next slide, you'll see my design solution. And so
Liz, do you mind if I just clarify something? It's like you're actually talking about 2 design strategies. One of them is waiting for the right source that you feel comfortable sourcing from. And then the second is like adapting your designs around what is actually existing.
So moving into the artisanal skill idea of what do they know how to cut? Because I need to support their skills in my design as well. And in the original slide that you saw, like there was a slide with the jade, with the B, which is the flat jade disc that you're probably familiar with, which was the first thing ever carved in jade that we know of. And so what I knew was they could create round shapes. And so I pivoted, and then after pivoting from the color, I pivoted to the shape in designing a round jade bracelet and acknowledging the things I can control, which is gold and castings. And so I designed my geometric shape to sit on the jade as opposed to be the jade. That was a moment where I was trying to innovate, but the world wasn't going to let me do that.
It's such a humbling example to share with everyone. I think it's really relatable, because sometimes you design something that you envision and it just won't work with how the world actually works, right? So the question for everyone is how can you strategize and be ready to innovate around what is actually possible?
Yeah. And I mean, also to note that I haven't even launched this bracelet yet. You are the first people to see it. And this whole process took me almost 5 years to get there.
So yeah, waiting for the right source and having patience and slow design is so key. So, all right, I think this transitions us into the third strategy that I wanted to talk about, which stems from having so many challenges in fitting these, positive impact sources that I'm passionate about into my current collection. To the point where the best strategy that I've found is actually being open to designing a new product category to support the source that I'm interested in using. So I'll start with one material, Fairmine Golds, which I'm really passionate about. This gold is mined by these miners here. And you can see a few of the nuggets in the miner's hand here. These are photos from a trip that I took in 2018. So what is Fairmine Golds? Fairmine Gold it's a label of golds that's created by an organization that prioritizes the well-being and the progress of the miners themselves. And the first thing that you need to know is that gold is sold at like a market, it has a fixed market price everywhere in the world. So gold has like one price. And when I'm purchasing Fairmine Gold as a jewelry designer, I pay about 15% above that market price. And that 15%, or that approximate 15%, goes directly back to the co-op of miners who not only are like guaranteed to get fair prices for their golds, which unfortunately is not always a standard in the gold industry, but they collectively work together to define what that extra premium that I pay goes towards, which is education to learn how to mine responsibly and efficiently, investing in equipment that allows them to be more responsible and efficient, safety equipment, environmental protection practices, and other community like support programs that are defined specifically by each mining co-op. We currently source from Peru, which is noted on the slide, but we've previously sourced from mining co-ops, Fairmines mining co-ops in Colombia, Mongolia. They're from all over the world. So I just want to add that in for perspective. So I love this material. I'm really passionate about its impact, and Fairmine Gold supports really important development projects in the mining communities where the gold comes from. But as I said, the price is higher than the standard price of gold. So with that said, like it can make our designs more expensive than a customer might feel comfortable paying. Here you can see on the left are recycled gold prices, and this delicate gold and diamond ring in the middle is $270 made with recycled gold. If we were to make it with Fairmine Gold prices, it would jump up to $470. And so when it comes to like this everyday gold jewelry, one of my design challenges is how can I use positive impact sourcing without creating a frustrating customer experience?
One thing to also note is that the recycled gold is also at a slight premium above fair market, standard market gold.
Recycled, well. Yeah, also a little bit more expensive. So this question also comes into play with fair trade gemstones that I source from responsible mining communities. We sell our everyday jewelry online. And I think so many of you here can relate to how important the photograph of that product is in understanding like what you're going to get. And customers really do want all of this, perfect sustainable sourcing to be behind every purchase that they make, but they also might not realize like how that need for consistency affects our ability to integrate supply chains into the product that falls into this category. So on the right is an example of a ring that we have on our website. This is a pale periwinkle blue that is like really popular right now. And it's a play on the traditionally valued like deep, dark sapphire blue.
I think that that's an interesting moment, like because it's very close to the traditional sapphire blue, but all of these colors here that you see for Montana sapphires are sort of alternatives to the traditional model of beauty and standard of beauty within jewelry that is expected. And I think it's amazing that people are interested in all of these different colors. It allows us to use all of the things available rather than just have a bunch of things sitting in, this is where the heritage stones and heirloom stones come in, or rather the heritage cut stones, that they're sitting in a safe somewhere because nobody would buy these other colors that you see. And I mean, even the gray tones and these pale greens are so beautiful. So I love that you're working with all the colors now, Wing.
Right. I guess actually, and that works in like the program that I've built out. But the point that I really wanted to drive here with these two photos is that like the photo on the right is what people like want to buy from us because that's what they're seeing on the website, and they want that consistency because they want reassurance of like what they're getting. But on the left, these Montanan sapphires, this is their consistency of color, which is not consistent at all, especially with the ring that I'm promising to make. And while customers are more open to these colors, they're not necessarily ready for it when they want to purchase something that they see online. And and with a product that we kind of have to make in multiples because of the size of the business that I am, and how they want to purchase from this specific category of everyday jewelry. So Bliss, like I think that appreciation is best valued in this new category that I created for specifically like our positive impact stone and gold sourcing, which is custom jewelry and one of a kind ring programs. So I've strategically designed these programs to highlight the value and the uniqueness of nature and like all of the colors that the stones come in, as you pointed out. But therefore, that's also highlighting the uniqueness within the inconsistent supply chain or inconsistent colors in the supply chain. And these customers are definitely, this is an area because it's one of a kind and because it's custom made, there's an extra level of like desire for like what's special. And there's more time spent to really learn about the supply chains and again, just bring value. And so this was a strategy that I created to make these supply chains work in my business. Previously, we just didn't do one of a kinds and we didn't do custom jewelry. And so this is where I realized I could like drive this impact in a more thoughtful way. Bliss, this is actually such a huge part of your business, custom jewelry and one of a kind jewelry. So do you want to elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I see actually that lack of consistency in stones like those Montana sapphires, to me, I see as an opportunity. And I love it because it gives me the freedom to be creative. It gives me the freedom to let people choose stones that connect to them. And it is perfect for custom design. And my entire business strategy as a small business is connected to custom design. But one thing to note also is that there's a different sort of value scale to stones that you mentioned. Like you will work with lots of small stones, whereas I'll work with one really big stone. And so in regards to impact, like I would love to have a huge impact, but my impact is sort of smaller and bigger because of the scale of the cost of the stones that we're buying that are supporting our community.
These examples are all to say that like consistency isn't circularity.
Yeah, I mean, I think that circularity lends itself to a lot of different things. And I think it depends on the medium that we're talking about. But within our businesses, it doesn't always connect.
And circular thinking is a lot more nuanced, and consistency is all about like making things right. And so they don't really work together, which is, I think, at the core of this presentation. Okay, so scale within the spectrum of, and how does it contribute to the spectrum of conscious jewelry? How does scale affect your conscious design decisions and your overall impact? As I described, Wake has basically a mid-scale business because we make multiples of things. Any of you who know my jewelry in this audience before this class might recognize my jewelry from like the opals and rings that we do make multiples of. The wins in being a mid-scale business with a conscious like sourcing practice is that we have wider reach. We have more customers. We have a wider conversation to talk about these practices, to educate customers on like what they can ask questions about and how they can shop more conscientiously. I can reach more people in being a mid-scale audience. We have more customers, and that also means we can make deeper impact in the communities that we work with. That said, there are so many challenges on top of the ones that I already described in creating high volume orders, because that means there's higher pressure for that consistency and perfection. And it contradicts this idea of circularity that we're talking about and what's available from responsible mining communities and like how we can use that conscientiously. One of the main challenges that I found is that the number of stones like from responsible mining communities that I can use is usually much smaller than the number of stones that we need for a mid-scale business. And, you know, I like to share this example because this was a really big learning experience for me. These are all stones from the same mine from the Nyala region in Malawi. This sapphire mine had all different colors, and I was really excited about this project because over the course of 10 years, the responsible mine had developed responsible mining practices, fair wages, but it also brought running water to the local villages. It brought schools to over almost 1,000 kids, reforestation programs, a healthcare center, nursery programs. And it was all run by a community board, so it wasn't like a Western imposition, which is really important to me. And the thing that really got me excited was the profit sharing model. 50% of the stones that I purchased from this mine would go right back to that community board to distribute into the community development projects that they had. And it was impressive. I was really excited about it. I was like, I'm going to go all in. How can I drive the most impact in a positive way in this community? How many collections can I design around them? So I looked at all the colors and I was like, I'm going to use as much as I can. So on the left, you can see I use the dark blues. I use their baby blues, and then I used their blush pink sapphires in our collection pieces that I knew would drive volume orders. And then everything that fell a little bit out of those spectrum of colors to be considered consistent for my customers, I put in one-of-a-kind rings. So that allowed me to use as much of the available material as possible and therefore drive as much positive impact in this community as I could as like a designer and a business person. So with that said, like I was really excited about this design strategy, but I had completely misgauged how much of the material was available. And within 1 year, we had almost used up all of the stones that they were able to mine, that the mine was able to provide me. And we had to switch our stone sourcing into mostly heritage supply chains. And so while these are still responsibly sourced items, they don't participate anymore in that profit sharing model that contributed back to the mining community in the Nyala region. And so, you know, this was a really huge lesson for me. I was really disappointed. I was like embarrassed because I had this idea that I could create like this long-term, like deep impact through my designs. And yet I hadn't taken into consideration like what the earth could yield and how the mine would operate. All of those things are out of my control as a designer, and taught me this lesson of like how I have to be more conscientious of that. But the question for me in my design process is, how do I design for long-term, like sustainable impact? And how can I continue those relationships? We still source as much as we can from this mine because the profit sharing model still exists, but there is less available and less to be had. And so I wanted to share this example of like how challenging it is to integrate these supply chains into a mid-scale business. We're not even a big business.
I mean, I think that that has a lot to do with just owning a business and being an entrepreneur and acknowledging that there's pivots and changes that are going to happen. And I think you had a really great solution to how to navigate that change. But I think it didn't disappear, the impact that you made. And I think that is still a really beautiful thing.
Thanks. I appreciate that. I mean, that's definitely one of my takeaways for sure.
Yeah.
And another takeaway that I had is that, you know, the small business format of like one-of-a-kind programs and custom jewelry really does work well. Bliss, this is what you say is your own category. Could you take us through like the wins and the challenges there?
Yeah, my strategy as a small business is small. Like I've been a small business my whole career and I intend on staying that way. I really like having a small business. And what that means is I make a made to order product, and that provides an opportunity for having a lot less waste. Like an example being, I'm not making a ton and then not selling them. And so therefore there isn't as much waste. And I talked earlier about the higher value stones. But I think one thing to think about in terms of the idea of what does made to order mean, and what I'm asking you or my customer to make with me is I'm asking for a partnership essentially. And the agreement that you know you're going to shop small and have less waste means that I don't have anything ready for you. You have to wait for it. And so it's an understanding that you're stepping away from this immediacy mindset where you, for instance, like we all have, maybe we don't all shop on Amazon, but like if you're waiting for a cart from Amazon to come and you expect it to come tomorrow or even today, like it can be really frustrating, or if it comes in 7 days, but like 7 days is really fast. And it takes me several months sometimes to make a ring. And
Right. So you do have the challenge of like having smaller impact as a small business compared to a mid-sized business like mine, but you have again like this opportunity for an immediate partnership with the customer and have them understand like what the value is behind that and how ditching like immediacy and those expectations like uplifts the value of your of sourcing small and like having less waste and just being more intentional through and through.
yeah, and that leads us to the next slide. I mean, I think that like we share a philosophy in a lot of things, and I think that philosophy connects directly to design decisions. And the image that you're looking at right here on the right is a woman miner from the Moyo Gems Initiative in Tanzania. This project is really special to both of us. It's sort of, in a way, it represents how we hope sourcing will be in the future because it's such a beautiful mine to market story. But just to take a step back to remember what we started with this is an artisanal small scale miner, this woman miner, and 40 to 50% of that 40 million artisanal small scale miners in the world are women. Women serve as the anonymous base of the global supply chain in many cases. So just to remember again, like for every miner, there's 17 people that are connected to that miner. Their average family size is 5. So what happened with this scenario is that the women miners are registered and licensed, and they go in and they mine. And there is an NGO called PACT that stepped in and worked with an in-country organization called TAWOMA, which is the Tanzania Women's Association, and helped the Tanzanian women with a project where they were connected to the Gemological Institute of America, and they created a gem identification program. So what was happening previously was the women miners were coming out and they had all of their stones, and they would go and they would sell them to a vendor, and the vendor would just give them a price for all of them, and they would just have to, that's what they had to take. But once they had the gem identification program, they were like, no, this stone is, a turquoise or tanzanite or whatever it is that it was, a garnet, and it's worth more. And so the amazing thing with the story was in a short period of time, they were making 2 to 3 times the amount of money that they had. And the final part of the mine to market story is that there is a international buyer who then is how we have access to these stones. So they created a sustainable business model for the women miners to sell their products directly, and hopefully we can all consistently buy from them. So I waited once I found out about this organization, I heard about it really early stage, and they were still in their learning process of the gem identification program. I waited like months and months and months, and finally there was a market day, and then the stones had to be cut. And when the stones arrived, there were only like 30 or 40 stones that were even available to purchase. And of those stones, only 2 were stones that worked for me, for my customer.
How long did it take for them to mine those stones? Like, so that we can give everyone like an idea of like how much it takes to get so little.
They were mining for months. Programs, I think, are the future, and they're a model for sustainable business. And I think that understanding the nuances of how to manage being a conscious designer and these supply chains is something that we think is really important.
Right. I think that this goes to show like even at a mid-scale business and a small scale business, like we will find like the supply might not meet like the demand right now. And I think that's like really important because everything's a work in progress, right? So our approach to provenance-based design is progress, not perfection. It takes time, it takes trial and error, and that's what we just described with Moyo Gems and with the Fairmine golds that I've been using and the stones that I was sourcing from the Nyala region. So we just want to return back to this idea. If we valued all of our materials like we value our gold and precious materials, then circular systems would exist in every aspect of our lives. Like, how can we get there? How can we be conscientious about where everything comes from, since we do value all of these things? And how can that spread out into the rest of our lives?
So Lydia, I see you have a question here that says, how do we know whether a brand meets these standards or not? The thing is that there aren't really any international standards for ethics for our industry that we have. Like there are some that have been put in place individually for different countries, but I think that goes back to you. Like, what are your standards and what is okay with you and what is your ethos? And I actually think that's a big question, and you might not have an answer for that. Like we and I have spent a lot of time with our companies really asking ourselves these hard questions. And sometimes it's a question of just your gut and knowing, like, if I don't have an answer to that question, is it still okay for me to like vote with my wallet by buying something from that company?
Right. My approach is like maybe a little jarring, but I always think about like, what questions am I scared to ask this person? What, because this was my own path of learning, right? I was like, what am I scared of finding out? Because that's actually what I want to know. I want to know if the answer is okay or not. And I want to know if there's an answer, because you don't have an answer if you don't ask. And if you ask and you still don't have an answer, how do you feel about that?
Another question is, what do you think about jewelry from e-waste from Catherine? I love that question. I'm actually working on a project to make jewelry out of, it's obviously this is exactly what circularity is. So I love that. And the thing that I would say is, what I hope is that if I'm buying gold that was from a computer, that you didn't only melt down the gold, but the company used all of the other components of that computer and didn't just throw away, the plastic with it, which is made of silica and all of these other, there's so many other elements that are in there. So I think it's a great idea, but I think it has to be holistic.
Right. And then how are those electronics actually sourced? Where do the electronics come from? Do they come from countries abroad where there's, it's really interesting.
The project that I'm working on is their like end of life electronics only. So it is not taking away from something that would actively be used in the world. What advice would you give to a young entrepreneur wanting to start a socially responsible business from the ground up, from Caroline?
I have so much to say, but start with your materials. And, I think like an easy place to start is looking at those closed loop sourcing options that we talked about: recycled, heritage, and dead stock. And start there. See how you feel about that. Like, what does it mean? And like, do you want to drive even more positive impact from there? And start building your ethos. Really, one of the biggest takeaways that we hope that people will have from this is those, how to make those first steps.
How do you strike that balance between the need to make money to keep your business alive and the desire to source responsibility? Ooh, that's a hard one.
A dark question. Great question. I mean, I think that Bliss and I gave, what we tried to do in this presentation is show the differences of our businesses and how we approach that, and where the challenges are and where like the wins are in our different business models. I definitely have struggled with that.
Oh, like, how do you have a solution? Or
I mean, I guess I have like maybe a maximalist approach where I'm really just trying to do it all. And so for our areas that we need to grow, I really focus on recycled and heritage materials because there's more to give. It's more plentiful. And then I really create focused projects around the supply chains that I care about and I want to be using and supporting. And so again, like thinking about your product strategy and understanding how that connects to your business and the pace at which you want to work is really important. I have a part of my business that is fast and makes multiples. And I also have a part that's like yours, Bliss, that is focused on one of a kinds and slow design and spending the time on storytelling. And when I combine both, I hope to slowly but surely forge that need of partnership and understanding from our custom customer into our business, which is more about multiples and like a faster pace. And
I mean, I think that money, I come from like a super middle class family, and I have like a lot of trauma around the fact that my product is so expensive. I so struggle with it. And in fact, like the price of gold went up recently and I had to raise my prices more than I was comfortable with, but I had come up against a very difficult decision. Like, will I work and not pay myself? Or will I raise my prices and give my team a raise and give ourselves access to better lives internally. Like, I think that like sometimes it's just very expensive to make things consciously. And I think all I can hope is that people understand that we are doing something and trying to forge things forward. And sometimes at the moment it costs more. The goal is for me to lower my prices because I would love for it to cost less. But in doing that, I simultaneously launched the Jade collection, which is at a price point that is more achievable and more comfortable for me, something that I could afford to buy myself. So this is something that I will always struggle with. And the goal is for sourcing responsibly to become the norm and for it not to cost any more and be exactly what everybody always gets. Vera Santos, you asked Wing, you mentioned earlier, Wing, that about creating model communities. She wanted to ask you what you mean by that.
I think if we're referring to the slide where we were talking about investing in development models that already exist and that will create like examples for other mining communities to work off of, like, okay, projects like that mine in Malawi in the Nyala region and Moyo Gems and Fairmine Gold, like they're few and far between. Like they take a lot of energy to organize and to create and make sure that to introduce like the idea of like even a cooperative to these villaged areas and to educate them on the value of a stone. All of that information takes time to build until they're even making mining like materials that like can be exported to us as designers. So there's so much that goes into these projects. And I think that's a huge reason why they're so rare and why I'm even more passionate about supporting them. And for me, like as a designer, like not specialized in like humanitarian work at all. So I really look to these projects that have that NGO support behind them already for me to support. So I, as a designer, I'm looking to support these existing like development projects that will then act as a model for new projects to come. From what I understand, like I know that that mine in Malawi that I keep referencing, like that acted as a model for another transparent and like responsible mining project that's based in Sri Lanka that we also work with today. And this world takes a lot of work and there are very few examples, and the people that work on it, that world of stone vendors, NGOs that work on this project, and as well as like the people who work on like educating miners on like the value of the stones, that world is really small. And so when you're supporting one development project, you're actually supporting many to come because all these people are working on more than one project and they take, years to create. I don't exactly know how long Moyo Gems has taken so far, but that project in Malawi was over 10, 11 years old to get to the point.
There's another question from Erica. She asked, what advice do you have for consumers looking to make responsible purchases that contribute to sustainability and green, because green marketing can be tricky and deceiving. Sophia Lee did a talk on greenwashing and wokewashing, if you didn't see it.
I think you can always start with the simple question of like, where is it from? Is it recycled? If it comes from a specific place, then they should be able to at least give you a country of origin. I, as a designer, still ask that question, where is it from? And then I build my questions like, oh, have you been? Like, what's your proximity to this place of origin? And how close are you to this material? That's my personal approach. But I think a consumer can ask that simple question and build their curiosity from there. If the answer is it's recycled, it's from a circular source.
I come from Nepal. My question is, how do jewelry designers also educate consumers about environmental justice and social justice hand in hand? Because where these stones are found, especially in developing country like Nepal, due to our political instability and corruption and lack of proper legal implementations, many times in extracting minerals, our mountains' biodiversity is being compromised every day in indigenous communities who depend on these biodiversities. How do designers bring that to the forefront of awareness?
I mean, I think that question is really powerful in and of itself. And we have 144 people still here who can hear that. I mean, that's the reality of a lot of these small mines and these small mining communities. And if they're living at a subsistence like level, there isn't a lot of opportunity for them to change them themselves. And so educating consumers on awareness is something that designers, I think, could talk about. These are reasons why we choose the sources that we do, Bliss and I. And so sharing the reasons why with our customers, whether it's in personal appointments with those custom clients or whether it's on social media, I think is really powerful so that we can share just even that perspective that you're providing everyone here with.
You know, something we didn't touch on really was like the impact of biodiversity that happens in mining or with dredging or, you know, open ocean mining, which is like so devastating for so many reasons. And like we're so from Hawaii, like the ocean is so sacred to me. But I think this might be something where we'll send some follow-up information for those of you who this might be the first time you're hearing of it. It's an interesting, devastating thing to learn, but it might help you build out that ethos if you're still looking for it. To answer the question, like there's a really thin line between like scaring people and depressing people and exciting people. And so by making purchases that don't contribute to those types of problems, that's our activism. And that in many ways is what Wing has been talking about this whole time, but also trying to help build out systems. Like our goal for the Moyo Gems initiative is for that to be something that can be transferred all over the world, you know? So hopefully in helping programs like this build, it will create easy models for people to follow and then copy and build within all of these different communities. And that's the goal.
From Samia, how do you go about doing the research for the material you source if you started out without knowing anything? I think both Bliss and I can relate to that, being in that place. My answer is like you build a community, you look for the community, and you start there because the audits and like these big companies like auditing programs and certification programs are often maybe overwhelming to a jeweler that's just starting out, but you can talk to people if you find the right community. There's Ethical Metalsmiths, there's the Chicago Responsible Jewelry conference.
I think source material is something really important to talk about because Googling is a dangerous world of question marks. And looking into what documents and what articles you're reading and who those people are and what gives them value to have an opinion to listen to is really important. When I do my research, I read a lot of sort of really boring government documents, Wing and as well, or something from, you know, I think it's really easy to find out where the regional communities are that are the makers. And so you can look into that and research what NGOs are working on the ground and maybe see if they've published anything. And I think that's a great way to start. I would like to believe that we can trust the NGOs and their research. And also the government documents are interesting as well. There's a lot, you know, the UN SDGs are something that once you go into that and you start learning more about that, there's so much information. It's really overwhelming. And I think that you'll find that you have a lot to start with, actually. So thank you so much, everyone that's here. We really appreciate it. And Wing, also want to say thank you to you. You are incredible. And I feel so honored to have done this with you.
Thank you so much for your partnership in this. It's been so fun putting the class together for all of you. So I think that it's been really fun to bring both of our angles into the same topic where we have a lot of overlap. So just thanks for your time. And Bliss, thank you so much for your time and all of your input. It's been really an honor. Bye.